From the center of the universe, Toronto, Ontario, Canada, this is the SDM Show with your host, Rob Cairns. The SDM Show focuses on business, life, productivity, digital marketing, WordPress, and more. Sit back, relax, grab your favorite drink, and enjoy the show. Here is Rob.
Hey everybody, Rob Cairns here. I'm the founder, CEO, and chief creator of Amazing Ideas at Stunning Digital Marketing. In the WordPress space, with modern WordPress, it is one of the most exciting times I've ever been in the space. In today's podcast, I sit down with Anne McCarthy of Automatic to talk about the upcoming WordPress 6.2 release and beyond. Grab a drink, sit back, relax, enjoy the conversation that Anne and I had. This episode of the SDM Show is sponsored by Stunning Digital Marketing, the agency to handle all your WordPress website security needs. Go on over to stunningdigitalmarketing.com and find out how we can help you secure your website so you no longer have an issue with backups, being hacked, or your website being compromised. That's stunningdigitalmarketing.com. Hey everybody, Rob Cairns here. And today I'm with my guest, Anne McCarthy from Automatic. How are you today, Anne?
Doing great.
It's always good to have you. It's good to catch up. A lot's going on with 6.2 and WordPress. Beta 3 came out today as of this recording. How's the stability of the betas going so far?
It's going well. I'm actually one of the core editor triage leads. So I spend most of the time looking at the ways in which it's not stable. So it's always funny to be asked that because I'm like, I could rattle off 10 things that I'm worried about. But on the whole, it's incredibly stable. I kind of think back to the 5.9 release or even the last couple releases. Things feel really solid. And I think a lot of that's due to a lot of hard work from contributors moving forward these features long before the beta period came up. So I actually feel really good about the cycle of things and the pace of work and the features that have gone in.
Yeah, and I'll say from somebody who is in and out of WordPress on a daily basis, I think the stability hasn't been a big issue, like with the 6.1 and the 6.1.1 releases. They've been handled really well, so kudos to the entire release team and everybody else who's worked on it. It's a big undertaking. One of the things we were talking about before we went there, and I thought we'd jump in there before we really dive into 6.2. We shouldn't use WordPress because it's open source. And I'm going to open that can of worms because I like to. What's your feeling on that?
I find it to be, I mean, we were going back and forth on this. It's very short-sighted and narrow, and it feels like fear-mongering or a lack of understanding of how the internet works and what it's built upon. And I get it, though, because there's a certain thing where explaining the concepts of open source, it's almost like it takes 10 minutes versus it takes like a minute to kind of dismiss open source. And so I think for today's world where, you know, we might want it fast and we want to have something that's like, I think some folks want a proprietary thing. They think that that is safer. There's a lot of education that has to be done. And that's one of the things that actually I think the next generation I'm really interested in is they don't necessarily want the slick tools. They don't want the next, like the tracking that we have in place or like if something is too smooth, there's like kind of a creep factor. And I've been reading a lot of research around how the next generation would rather have something that's like not as smooth, but has better privacy or that's in line with their values. And so I think there could be some really interesting stuff around educating folks on open source and how it actually works so that we aren't just stuck in that loop of that conversation.
Yeah. And frankly, without open source, we wouldn't have the internet as it is today. I mean, I can remember at a time, and I'm a little older, so I'll say that, is when we dealt with servers called Archie, Veronica, and Gopher back in the day before the web was prominent. So without all that collaboration, I don't think we'd be there. And a lot of people forget that most internet services are based on the Linux operating system, and Linux is as open source as anything else out there. So I think people need to realize what's actually driving the internet before they make comments like that, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's almost the reason we were talking about before is because there's a nonprofit that I worked with who is switching away from WordPress. And and that was part of the reasoning that was given. And it was really amazing to read the email that was sent from the agency that they were trying to work with. And it just it feels almost like unethical because I would rather explain all the options, get all the things out on the table. And then if someone chooses not to do open source for whatever reason, like that's fine. Like, okay, they'll deal with the consequences of it after, but it almost feels like a sleight of hand. Like they're getting someone on a different platform without understanding the full situation. And I think it's when people are working in that realm, I think it's really important to have all the facts on the table.
So true. And I believe in it so much. I was sharing with you that this weekend I'm speaking at PodCamp Toronto, which is a big podcast conference. And one of the things in my presentation is if you want to host a website for your podcast away from your podcast host, hosted on WordPress. So that's kind of where I sit. And I have a multitude of reasons for that. So I think that's the way to go. So thank you for clarifying that, Anne. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
So 6.2 is coming out. Exciting time. There's a beta label coming off. And this beta label has caused so much controversy out in the community. How do you feel about that? What's going on with the beta label and why now?
Yeah, so this is a really good can of worms to dig into, and I'm really excited to talk about. I will not caveat this, but I will frame it as dig into the features that are coming to 6.2 to understand the beta label removal. I think sometimes people fixate on the beta label removal without understanding the progression and the evolution that's happened. So to start, it's like 5.9 introduced the site editor. We added a beta label, which I think is the first time in like WordPress history that's been added. So it's been through multiple major WordPress releases, like this experience and these tools and these features. So there's a lot of stability there in terms of thinking about how the features are ready for production and have been. At the same time, there's kind of like different perspectives that float around. So from the block theme author point of view. So I've talked to a number of block themers in the community, and they're frustrated because they're building the latest and greatest block themes. But then when they try to give it to clients, it has the beta label. So it's confusing, right? It's like, I'm building production ready stuff. This is ready for a live environment, but then people get held up on the beta label. So in terms of adoption, there's something to think about there. And in terms of like the business of WordPress, like how is it compelling to build a block theme if there's a beta label on it, right? On the flip side, there's also concerns from the accessibility community. How do we make sure the site editor can be used for everyone? And I've been talking with a number of folks there, and there's been a lot of work and discussion around prioritizing issues across the different feature sets. But that's a huge thing to think about, is like, how do we make this available for everyone and not just for a small subset? And then you think about like the wider end user audience, kind of going back to the block theme author point of view, where it's like, there's a number of folks from VIP clients to just like the average person who, why would they be drawn to a beta label software? So in terms of removing it, it's partially to aid adoption, partially because the experience is more stabilized and ready. Like I think of the 6.2 release as setting the stage for both the present and the future of WordPress in many, many ways. And I think it's a really exciting time. And I think the beta label being removed is a marker of it. And I think of 6.2 as an invitation to folks and a signal to folks with this removal that there's both a number of features that are coming in this release, and the experience in general has been refined to a point that we feel confident about having it open for everyone.
Yeah. And I would say, from my perspective, and I know from many people's perspective, this is like one of the most exciting times. And I've been in WordPress for probably 14 years or 15 years. Mm-hmm. And it's probably one of the most exciting times out there, with full site editing, with blocks, with Gutenberg, with that whole ecosystem. I think it's a great time to be a designer in WordPress. It's a great time to make things happen. And I'll share with you, I was building a site this morning that I looked at, and I thought, this is going to take me a couple of days. And with blocks and the right block add-ons, I was able to put the site together in 5 hours.
Wow.
So that tells you something, right?
Yeah, that's very cool. That's one of the things. My dad always has a bunch of side projects. And every once in a while, if I have time, I'll tell him to like throw a site my way. And I'm like, I'll build it. Just tell me what you want. Just as like to stay in touch with like a practical example. We have like outreach program calls for testing, but there's something about having like a hands-on project. And I feel really grateful to folks who write about their experience and share that feedback so we can learn from them too. But yeah, it is a very exciting time. And I think the final piece of this is something that WordPress always balances is how do we release things that benefit a large number of people. And, because there's also this element of if we hold back the site editor, that also is an opportunity cost and causes damage. Because as we were talking about at the top of this call, someone could go to Squarespace or Wix or wherever. And so how do we continue to be cutting edge as WordPress and without like moving forward in a way that's like unsustainable or unethical? So it's a lot to balance. And it was a very thoughtful decision process, and it's all out in the open and public. So
yeah. And I would say a lot of it is, frankly, is agencies just not wanting to retrain their brains. I mean, I've done that. I was all in with page builders, up until about a year and a half ago. And then I decided the site that was going to go to the new way of doing WordPress, modern WordPress, as Brian Gardner likes to coin the phrase, if you've heard that term kicking around. And a shout out to Brian for what he does for the community and his team over at WP Engine. They do a great job. I decided to go on a live site. And the live site I decided to move was my own, which is risky in some sense, but not risky in another, because as I like to tell the story, I didn't move on a site to a dev site and then a development site back. I did it piece by piece because I had so much going on at the time. So I will tell people, please don't do that. It's not the best of ideas, but I will say it was a learning experience. And now that I've moved that site, I do not use a traditional old school page builder. I'm all in with a block-based page builder. In my case, it's core blocks that come built into WordPress, and it's the Cadence ecosystem. I've gone that route, and I think there's a multitude of reasons for doing that. So I think things are going in the right direction, Anne, personally.
Yeah, I agree. It's very exciting, the possibilities it opens up for folks like yourself and for designers, like you were talking about before. It's like you can basically build a block theme in the site editor or build a site. Like it's kind of a wild time where those gaps are just closing and closing and closing.
Yeah. And it's getting easier and easier and easier too. And what I would suggest to any agency or developer or designer out there is just because it's getting easier, please don't start dropping your rates, because remember, customers are paying you for your expertise, not an hourly rate. And we need to be very careful. We don't undervalue our expertise in what we're doing.
Yeah. And that's I want to add on to that, because part of the discussion on the site is like, it's opening up so much access and possibility, but there's another side to this, right? Is curating the experience. And so I actually just pushed an update earlier today to documentation around that to keep it up to date with 6.1 and 6.2, because there's a developer doc all about curating the editor experience, meaning what if you lock the interface down a little bit or provide certain defaults, but you limit customization further for a user? Because let's say someone doesn't need all the bells and whistles of the site editor. Part of being an expert in the agency space is offering a more locked down experience where you can go in and perhaps like make the tweaks that need to happen. But if someone wants a more contained thing where they're able to stay within brand guidelines, they can. And I think there's a lot to look forward to there. And one of the actually side experiments I have going on right now that it's not working the way I want it to, but I want to just have like a proof of concept, is like a block theme where you have different style variations, but each style variation is basically the same set of tools or the same colors and whatnot. But depending upon the style variation you use, one is called like novice, one is called learner, and one is called expert. And as you switch between the style variations, it changes how many tools are open or closed. So it's not, something isn't working, I'm doing something wrong, but it's just to have a proof of concept. You probably shouldn't use style variations for that in truth. But it's just kind of a thought experiment of like, imagine you install a block theme and you get a prompt that's like, hey, how much control do you want that you could change later on? I think it could be a pretty neat way of thinking about the future.
Yeah. As we go into 6.2, what new feature excites you the most?
Oh, what new feature excites me the most? That's a really good one. I probably would say the style book or this distraction-free writing mode. The style book is if you're using a block theme and you are in the site editor and you're making changes to your site, you can basically look at all of the elements of your site and see them as you're basically making changes. So before, in the previous experience with site editor, if you were trying to make changes to a block that wasn't in the template that you were looking at, you couldn't necessarily know how those changes would impact things. And the style book really closes that gap and provides a really neat design system almost where you can see, as the name suggests, it's a style book. You can see all the different aspects of your site in one place at once as you're editing. And I really think it's a game changer for end users and theme authors alike. It also automatically works with third-party plugins that add blocks to your site. So it's also pretty neat in that sense. Distraction-free writing mode, I have to mention because I use it all the time. And it's something that anyone using the block editor can enjoy. And it basically just, I know I've seen a lot of feedback over the years, and I've had my own feedback around the writing experience where if you want just like all the visual noise to go away, the block toolbar, the sidebar settings, all the inserters everywhere, like you can basically use this distraction-free mode and it's just like a blank page. You don't see any, you can use keyboard shortcuts, but you don't see any visual anything. And then if you hover up above, you can get the top toolbar back and kind of go in and out of that mode. But I am obsessed with it. I solely use it whenever I'm writing on my personal site. And I think it's a really neat thing for an everyday, old school blogger.
No, I would agree with it. It's probably the feature I'm most excited about going into 6.2 is the distraction-free mode because it's just easier to bring it up and write, and it makes life 10 times easier as far as I'm concerned. So that's a good one. We're moving to we talk about writing to collaboration down the road, aren't we?
Mm-hmm.
That's
we are gearing up there. I'm like, there's a post from Matthias called like Phase 2 Finale, where he talks about Phase 2 of Gutenberg is all this full siting related stuff, including block themes and all sorts of gradual adoption pathways. And talking about 6.2 and WordPress 6.3, wrapping that up. And in between that, starting on Phase 3, which I'm terribly excited about. I think there's some really interesting explorations to happen. I think right now we'll likely see a lot of technical underpinning work happening rather than anything visual to start, because there's a lot to do like infrastructure side to get things in place. But I think even with the site editor, we'll see benefits where, having better revisions and having more robust saving process, like all that stuff ties into Phase 3.
Yeah, and I would say, and truthfully, I think you're going to have to be more careful at what type of host you get moving forward because, frankly, some of these low-cost hosts will not have the resources to cut some of these changes that are coming down the road. And I think some people are going to be shocked that if they want to do things like collaboration or maybe distraction-free writing or other things going on under the hood, they're actually going to want to probably increase their hosting plans in a big way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, especially for collaboration. I think you're right on the money about that. And that's part of the problem to solve. And there is a performance team where we've started talking about like block theme performance and generally like helping with classic themes and kind of making sure there's parity there. But I think coming up, it's on my mind to bring those folks in really early and make sure, all the different teams are involved in those discussions.
Yeah, I think it's really important. What else is coming in 6.2 that people should or should not be aware of?
Oh man, this is like a very robust thing to talk about, but there is a new experience of when you enter the site editor. So if you've used a block theme and you've explored the site editor, when you land back in there, rather than being dropped into your whatever's powering your homepage template, you're actually going to be met with a dark basically a dark sidebar frame where you can then in the sidebar scroll through your different templates and template parts and your primary navigation and see basically the whole of your site before actually going in and editing things. And this also means with this new experience, you can make changes to multiple different templates and then save all of that at once, which is pretty neat. But it's a big overhaul, and it's an exciting step forward that really, I think, in the future will lay the groundwork for a lot of extensibility with other plugins. So like if you're using like WooCommerce or something, I could imagine a world in which WooCommerce like mimics this experience where you're drilling down into specific pieces, but also able to kind of see the whole of your site. So that's a big one. Another one is the navigation block has an additional way of editing menus, and it's baked into the sidebar as well. And so you can edit directly in the canvas as you're used to using the navigation block. But there's also just this new experience, which has gotten really good feedback from the FSC outreach program, as well as like various other folks who I've bugged to test it. And so I'm very excited about that because I think it helps kind of like marry the old experience with the new block paradigm and provide like a pretty easy to use flow. And that's the navigation block has been something we've gotten a lot of feedback on over the years.
It's one of my favorite ones. So
yeah. And of course there's like, I know a lot of folks are kind of banging the door down about like mega menu stuff, but there's not a lot to report on there. Related though to like more complex blocks, there is like also a very welcome change with better organization with the block settings. Thanks to some split control. So basically, before when you'd open up, using a block and you'd select a block and you'd open up the sidebar settings, you would be met with basically all of the settings shoved into just the entire sidebar. And it was kind of hard to see how they might impact the block in which way. And so now there's like some really nice organization and split tabs. So there's an appearance tab and there's a settings tab or styles and settings. So you can get a better sense of what you actually want to do to the block without having to like scroll and read each setting. So I'm really excited about that. And for block theme authors or for plugin authors, you can actually like make sure your options that you want to have show up in the right place based on how you register them.
That's interesting.
It is a really interesting, and to me, this is part of why I said like this release both sets the stage for the present and for the future, because this is part of what, as we add more and more tools, we have to think about scaling the experience. And this like split control, I think is part of that future. There's also a ton of pattern improvements. There's header and footer patterns baked into things. The pattern categories have been revamped. The inserter pattern experience has been redesigned to make it a bit easier to see and preview. Again, this is like you think about a growing number of patterns. How do you scale the interface so it's easier to use? And that's another area in which like that design thought has gone into. And then the last thing I'll mention, which is going to be a ton of stuff, there's just a bunch of style improvements and features. So the style book I mentioned, there's also like a neat inline preview when you're editing styles in the site editor. You can style an individual block and then apply it to all instances of the block. So you can basically apply it globally, which is really cool.
I so love that.
It's such a time saver. And like being able to do that with a click of a button, I think is awesome. And then a long time thing is custom CSS. So we typically want to be filling the gaps with design tools to make sure folks aren't having to rely on custom CSS, and so WordPress can handle more things. But for those gaps where they do still exist, there is a custom CSS both on a per block basis and globally for your site baked into the site editor now, which has been a long-standing thing folks have wanted. And then there's also just copy-paste block styles, which is pretty nifty and easy, and you can use that anytime you're using blocks. So that's kind of what I would call like the super high level things. There's, for any super nerds, there's some really neat performance improvements with theme JSON that sees a pretty big increase in the performance of these themes. So I think it's like, I'm looking at this. Yeah, it's a 23% performance gain for themes with theme JSON and 9% for themes without theme JSON.
That's a big deal. 23% is huge.
Yeah, it's awesome.
So there were 3 spots I wanted to go down if I can. Mm-hmm. And when I talk to other developers or I listen to designers or I think about what I'd like, there's kind of 3 areas of big concern out there. Do you mind if I go down that road with you? So the first one is the nag notices that plugins put out. I have to go there. there's a lot of, and I understand plugin authors have to make money. But I don't think bombarding the WordPress dashboard with nag notices is necessarily the best approach. And I think a lot of these guys think that's better than being involved in the community. Are we doing anything to kind of shore that up a little bit and clean that up a bit?
Yeah, there is like some really interesting, I think it's called WP Notify.
Yes.
That I want to say Jonathan Bossinger, this was like years ago. I'm like trying to remember because it was to date when I had this conversation, it was like beginning of the pandemic. But this is like one of the things that I know has been discussed. And I totally agree. I think it degrades the experience. I have definitely had that issue where I'm opening up a WordPress site and I'm like, oh dear Lord, like how many things are asking for my attention? And it just feels messy and it's not unified. I think there's some really interesting stuff done around, I think it's like the feature notifications channel that relates to this, if I'm not mistaken. I also think alongside like wider projects like that, a lot of thought has been put into for years now. I think part of what's being done with components in the WordPress project and these kind of like larger interface changes could in theory set some standard for it. So like if you're building a new plugin and you want to use the latest and greatest, imagine you have a component you could use to notify folks of stuff or have like an admin notice. And then imagine if you use that, it then works nicely with all the rest of the plugins that are also using that. Because we do want to get away from the, for lack of a better word, like hijacking that ends up happening. And it's almost like who can have the biggest banner message at the top of this thing. And I find it to be like pretty frustrating because you kind of want an experience where people are engaging with your stuff when they want to, not because they have to or they accidentally click on it. Like I'd be very curious to know how that's actually working for folks.
Yeah. And then the second interesting discussion I've heard come up a lot in my circles lately is the admin dashboard itself, while we're talking about UI changes, is looking so 15 years ago and it needs a refresh. Any thoughts on that one that you can add?
Yeah, I totally agree. There's actually, this is part of what, let me see if I can find that post. This is like loosely discussed in some of the phase 2 finale. Because I totally agree. I think there's a lot that needs to be done to kind of bring in an updated design across these things. I think Yoast recently had...
That's where it came out of, was Yoast redesign, and people said if Yoast... And they did a very good job of the redesign, to be honest with you. Said, if Yoast can do it, why aren't we doing it in core and just being done with it?
Yeah, and I think that is, in the future, that is definitely, I think, the plan. I know that Matthias also has a great post. I think it's called like Reimagining WP Admin or something like that. I'll have to find these links because I love to drop links. But there's a really interesting experience of kind of what I was describing where it's like if you're using, imagine like, I don't know if you've explored 6.2 at all, but the new experience of entering the site editor, the project name for that is basically called browse mode. And that interface and experience could be applied, like other plugins could use it. It also could, in theory, replace WP Admin. So there are some really interesting designs floating around in Figma files, imagining that as, the future of WordPress, where it's like if you're entering the experience rather than like entering WP Admin, then entering the site editor, imagining that browse mode, dark gray kind of like sidebar where you're drilling into content, imagining that being the main way you interact with the site, and having plugins basically like plug into that interface, which I think would be really cool. I think it's going to be tricky. And I agree that the rest of it needs to be updated. This is where I have to say like contributions welcome, because it's definitely a ton of work.
And then while we're on the contributions welcome scene, we'll go to my favorite pet peeve and many others, I'm sure, is the media library. And I hate to go down that road too, but the media library, I think part of the problem is, and I don't know if you and I have talked about this before, it's not really, quote, a sexy project to work on. So I think the media library's kind of been neglected for a long, long time. It needs a refresh. Is there any plans to do anything with the media library?
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought this up because the outreach program actually did like what I call them like explorations rather than calls for testing. So it's basically like exploring something more like far off and in the future rather than a call for testing is something more tangible in today. Today's like WordPress. And so I did an exploration, I think it was like this time last year on media. And part of why we did it is because Openverse is now part of the WordPress project. There's also the WordPress photo directory. Like there are a number of media related things building up and bubbling up within the WordPress project. And so I totally agree. I dabble with photography and I love images and I use a lot of them. So yeah, so finding like the organization of the photos has always been maddening to me. And so I totally agree. I think we'll see some things shift as like integration with the WordPress photo directory and Openverse, which is actually one of the things to come in 6.2 is in the inserter. You'll be able to, there'll be a media tab where you can actually search for images from Openverse and you can obviously disable that as well. But I think that will kind of naturally lead to more work being done to better organize photos. And one of the things that came up in the all things media exploration was like imagining a world where, you're adding a photo to your site and you could also like check a box and add it to Openverse and add it or the WordPress photo directory. Like there's a lot of really interesting ways in which the two could work in tandem. And I think as, Openverse is organizing so much content, what can we learn from how Openverse is doing it and bringing those insights into the media library to have better organization. So I think there's a nice handshake that could possibly happen in the future.
Yeah, that would be nice. I think it's coming. It's just a case of there's so much on the plate for Automattic. Mm-hmm. It's just getting us there, right? And prioritizing what needs to be done now, what needs to be done later. And I really think, like from my standpoint, anybody up at Automattic is listening to the feedback. I know you do. I know people like Birgit know. I know Matthias certainly listens to feedback. So I think the perception that, and I know it's some of it out there, and I always like to break it down and says people aren't listening. Do us a favor, folks. If you're having problems, please go open up a ticket and do this the right way. Like, don't just jump on social and say you're unhappy. Actually, go open up a ticket. If you're having problems, open a ticket. There's a number of people out there who would gladly help you open it. Do us that favor, and let's kind of control the stream of where things are going. Right, Anne?
Yeah, it's super helpful. And I will say, if you can't get it to the right place, feedback is better than no feedback. I know some people, I often tell people, I'm like, just blog about it. If you're in the WordPress page, you probably have a WordPress site, just write a post and tag me in it or drop it to me or email to me. If that's what you can do, that's what you can do. And I actually have a list of 3 different posts I need to go through this week, or I don't need to, I want to. It's people taking the time to write feedback. And I see it as part of my job to seek that stuff out. So just as much as you're trying to share feedback, there's also a number of us who are seeking it out, but it does make it wildly easier if people open issues directly. And don't worry about if it's a duplicate issue. There are folks, there is a triage team that helps manage that.
Yeah. And I would say WordPress is in good hands with people like Anne, who's passionate about WordPress, looking after it for us. So I think you, amongst many of your colleagues, put us all in good hands. And I should tell you, that's really appreciated from the community.
No, I appreciate you saying that. It's honor and a privilege, and it's a responsibility I take really seriously. So WordPress has definitely changed my life, and I just want to keep helping it help others,
Mine too. I often tell the story when I started my digital agency 14 years ago and came out of the healthcare sector. I started doing websites in WordPress. I do many other things now, but that's kind of what laid the foundation for my agency. So it's changed mine as well. And this is always such a treat to get you for a half hour, an hour and chat WordPress. If somebody wants to get a hold of you, has some questions, feedback, what's the best way?
Nomad.blog is my website, and there's a contact form, and I truly welcome feedback. And I'm typically pretty responsive unless, if you catch me the week before the WordPress, the 6.2 release, might not be as responsive. But I love hearing from folks. And I really very much am someone who was taught WordPress and someone who knows what it's like to be a beginner. So if you're nervous about reaching out, like I am just a person. I would love to hear from you, and I'd love to help kind of get you connected to the right places. I'm also at ANNEZAZU, so Anne Zazu, on the Make Slack install. So you're welcome to just DM me there. I'm not on social media. I'm on LinkedIn, if that counts, but I'm off of all social media right now. Sometimes I'm on Instagram, but those are the easiest ways to get me.
And thanks so much for your time, and good luck with the release, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you, and thank you for having me.
Always a pleasure, Anne. This episode of the SDM Show is sponsored by Stunning Digital Marketing, the agency to handle all your WordPress website security needs. Go on over to stunningdigitalmarketing.com and find out how we can help you secure your website so you no longer have an issue with backups, being hacked, or your website being compromised. That's stunningdigitalmarketing.com. A very special thank you to Anne McCarthy for joining me on this edition of the SDM Show. Thank you for listening to this edition of the SDM Show. The SDM Show is brought to you by Rob Cairns and Stunning Digital Marketing. For more information about Rob Cairns and Stunning Digital Marketing, go to stunningdigitalmarketing.info. From here, you can connect to us on social media, go to our website, and even go to the podcast to subscribe. This podcast is dedicated to my late father, Bruce Cairns. Dad, I miss you very much. Keep your feet on the ground. Keep reaching for the stars. Make your business succeed.